The year 31 before Christ stands as one of the defining moments in Roman history, remembered with the same certainty as the legendary founding of Rome or the birth of the Republic. On the second day of September in that year, a decisive naval battle took place off the western coast of Greece, near the entrance to the Ambracian Gulf. There, Gaius Octavian, the adopted heir of Julius Caesar and the future Emperor Augustus, confronted the combined fleets of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. The struggle ended in a clear victory for Octavian. This triumph brought the last phase of the long Roman civil wars to an end and placed supreme authority in the hands of a single ruler. The old republican system, which had governed Rome for centuries, effectively came to a close, and a new political order emerged under Octavian's leadership. The government he created preserved many republican forms, but real power now rested with one man, establishing a system that would endure 4 generations. The rise of Augustus marked more than a political transformation. After decades of internal conflict, Roman society entered a period of stability and growth. Trade expanded, cities prospered, and literature and art flourished under imperial patronage. This long era of relative peace later became known as the Pax Romana. It brought a sense of order that many Romans believed had been lost during the years of civil war. Because of its lasting consequences, the victory at Actium is often regarded as a turning point, not only for Rome, but for the wider Mediterranean world. Yet the battle did not come out of nowhere. The events that led to Actium were deeply connected to earlier political struggles that had slowly reshaped Roman society during the final century of the Republic. Powerful generals had begun to dominate politics, armies became loyal to individual commanders, and traditional institutions gradually lost authority. The final confrontation between Octavian and Antony was the outcome of these long developments. To understand why this moment mattered so deeply, it is necessary to look back across the earlier history of Rome, including the beliefs and traditions that shaped Roman identity. Roman tradition traced the origins of the city to a distant, heroic age. Ancient stories described a time when divine beings lived among humans, and the earth provided food without labour. In that distant era, there was no war or suffering, and life was believed to have been simple and harmonious. Over time, this peaceful world gave way to an age of struggle and heroic deeds. It was during this later age that the legendary beginnings of Rome were set. One famous tale begins at a wedding feast among the gods. A divine figure associated with discord arrived uninvited and cast a golden apple into the gathering. The apple bore an inscription promising it to the most beautiful goddess. 3 powerful goddesses claimed the prize, and the decision was placed in the hands of a Trojan prince named Paris. He chose the goddess of love, who in return promised him the most beautiful woman in the world. That woman was Helen, already married to a Spartan king. Her removal from Greece led to a great expedition against the city of Troy. For many years, Greek armies attempted to capture Troy, but failed to overcome its defences. Eventually, they resorted to deception. Pretending to abandon the war, they sailed away after leaving behind a large wooden horse as an offering. Hidden inside the structure were armed soldiers. Believing the enemy had departed, the Trojans brought the horse into their city. During the night, the hidden warriors emerged and opened the gates for the returning army. The city was destroyed in a single devastating attack. Among the survivors was a Trojan leader named Aeneas, the son of a goddess and a mortal father. As the city burned, he was warned in a dream that he must escape and seek a new homeland. Carrying his household gods and guiding the remaining refugees, he left the ruins behind. His journey would eventually lead him across the sea to the shores of Italy, where destiny promised that a new people would arise from the Trojan survivors. Although these traditions belong to legend rather than history, they played an important role in Roman political life. Octavian claimed descent from Aeneas through his family line and therefore linked himself to divine ancestry. By emphasizing this connection, he presented his cause as the fulfillment of ancient destiny. His opponent Antony, who had strong ties to the Greek world, could be portrayed as standing on the opposite side of a long historical rivalry. The poet Virgil later celebrated this tradition in an epic poem that described Aeneas as the ancestor of a future empire that would restore a golden age of peace. Aeneas himself was not believed to have founded Rome. His son Ascanius established a settlement in the Alban Hills, known as Alba Longa. For many generations, the descendants of Aeneas ruled there as a line of kings. One ruler named Numitor lost his throne to his brother, who seized power and attempted to eliminate all possible rivals. Numitor's grandson was killed, and his daughter was forced into religious service that required a life without marriage or children. These measures were intended to prevent any future claim to the throne. Despite these precautions, Numitor's daughter bore twin sons, who were said to be the children of the god of war. The ruling king ordered the infants to be thrown into the Tiber River, but the current carried them safely to dry land near a hill beside the river. According to tradition, the abandoned children were discovered and nourished by a she-wolf until they were found and raised by a shepherd's family. As adults, the twins learned the truth about their birth and overthrew the usurper, restoring their grandfather to power. Afterward, they set out to establish a new settlement of their own. A quarrel between the brothers ended in violence, and one of them was killed. The surviving brother became the first ruler of the new city and gave it his name, Rome. Tradition placed this event in the middle of the 8th century before Christ. For several centuries, the city was governed by kings. Some of these rulers were remembered as capable leaders, but others were seen as harsh and oppressive. Eventually, resentment against royal authority grew strong enough to provoke rebellion. The last king was driven from the city, and the Romans replaced monarchy with a new political system based on shared authority. This new arrangement became known as the Republic. Instead of a single ruler, power was divided among elected officials and a permanent council of leading citizens. Each year, 2 chief magistrates were chosen to govern the state. Their authority lasted only a single year, and major decisions required cooperation between them, as well as the approval of the Senate. The system was deliberately designed to prevent the return of monarchy, even if this sometimes slowed decision-making. For many generations, the Republic proved stable and effective. Public life was considered an essential duty for ambitious citizens. Young men who hoped to enter politics often studied law or gained experience in the army before seeking office. Advancement followed a recognized sequence of positions that gradually led toward the highest rank. The first office usually held was that of a financial official responsible for managing public funds and supervising taxation and trade. Service in this position opened the door to membership in the Senate. Afterward, many candidates sought election to an office concerned with public buildings, markets, and civic festivals. These officials organized games and celebrations that helped them gain popularity among the people. Above these ranks stood the magistrates responsible for legal administration. They supervised courts and often acted as judges. Many also went on to command armies or govern provinces. Only after passing through these stages could a candidate seek the highest annual office. Roman society was divided from the beginning between powerful landowning families and the broader population of farmers, craftsmen, and labourers. At first, the leading families controlled the most important offices and dominated the Senate. The rest of the population organised their own assemblies and elected representatives to defend their interests. These representatives gained the authority to block measures they considered harmful, gradually forcing the political system to become more balanced. As Roman power spread across the Mediterranean, the army became one of the central forces shaping Roman society. The legions did far more than fight battles and defend frontiers. Soldiers constructed roads that connected distant provinces, built bridges across rivers, and carried fresh water into cities through long lines of aqueducts. Military service gradually became a path to advancement for men who possessed little property or influence. During the reforms associated with the general Gaius Marius, recruitment expanded beyond the traditional landowning classes. Large numbers of poorer citizens and even men without full civic rights entered the ranks. For many of them, the army became a lifelong profession, and veterans often received land grants and legal status when their years of service were complete. The expansion of Roman territory also encouraged the rise of a wealthy social group, known as the equestrian order. These men came largely from established families, but preferred commerce and finance to political careers. Opportunities created by conquest allowed them to accumulate considerable fortunes through trade, tax collection, and government contracts. Although prosperous, they did not always share the interests of the senatorial elite. At times, they found common cause with ordinary citizens in opposition to the traditional ruling class. Despite occasional support from these wealthy allies, the lower classes faced increasing hardship. Small farmers struggled to compete with large agricultural estates, owned by powerful families. These estates relied heavily on enslaved labourers captured during Rome's wars, making it difficult for independent farmers to survive. Wealth from conquest flowed mainly into the hands of those who were already rich, widening the distance between social classes. Political influence remained concentrated among the elite, and corruption became increasingly visible. Efforts by both ordinary citizens and equestrians to gain greater influence met with determined resistance. In the midst of growing tensions, the general Lucius Cornelius Sulla seized power and established himself as dictator during the early 1st century before Christ. Determined to strengthen the authority of the Senate, he used ruthless methods to eliminate opposition. Lists of political enemies were posted publicly, and those named could be killed without trial. Many leading figures from both the Senate and the equestrian order lost their lives in these purges. The violence left deep divisions within Roman society and intensified distrust between the different social groups. After Sulla's death, unrest continued across the Roman world. Political representatives sought to recover powers that had been reduced under the dictatorship. At sea, pirate fleets threatened trade routes and coastal settlements. In the east, the king of Pontus challenged Roman authority, while in Italy a large slave uprising erupted under the leadership of Spartacus. Over time, each of these crises was brought under control. Political rights were partially restored. Naval forces cleared the seas of pirates. Eastern campaigns stabilized the frontier, and Roman armies eventually crushed the slave revolt. Even so, the strain on Roman institutions was becoming increasingly apparent. A major conspiracy in the middle of the century revealed how fragile the Republic had become. A nobleman driven by ambition attempted to seize power after failing to win election to the highest office. He gathered supporters and planned a violent uprising that would eliminate many leading figures and overturn the government. The plot was uncovered in time, and those involved were prosecuted. The immediate danger passed, but the deeper problems that had produced the crisis remained unresolved. Further conflicts weakened the political order in the years that followed. Victorious commanders returning from distant campaigns expected recognition and rewards for their soldiers. but the Senate often hesitated to approve their proposals. Veterans who had served for years hoped to receive land, while commanders sought official acknowledgement of their successes. Disputes over these matters created bitterness among powerful men whose influence rested on military achievements. Decisions that might have appeared cautious to senators seemed insulting to ambitious generals and their supporters. Tensions grew as leading figures began to cooperate in order to overcome senatorial resistance. Personal alliances offered a way to advance political goals that could not easily be achieved through traditional channels. By combining influence and resources, powerful individuals hoped to dominate Roman politics and secure their own interests. Toward the end of the 60s before Christ, 3 of the most prominent men in Rome formed a private understanding that allowed them to support one another's ambitions. This arrangement had no official standing but proved highly effective. One of the partners soon gained election to the consulship and used his authority to push through measures that benefited all 3 allies. One of his earliest proposals aimed to provide land for veterans who had served under a distinguished commander. Although the measure followed established traditions, many senators opposed it because they feared it would strengthen the political influence of its supporters. When the Senate refused approval, the proposal was presented directly to the popular assembly, where it passed easily. Additional provisions increased the amount of land distributed, even though this required the seizure of property from private owners and reduced public revenue. Other decisions confirmed arrangements made in the eastern provinces and granted financial advantages to influential business interests. Family ties reinforced the political alliance when a marriage linked 2 of its leading members. After completing his term in office, one of the allies received command of northern provinces and soon launched a series of campaigns that expanded Roman control across a vast region. While he remained away from Italy for many years, political struggles continued in the capital. Rivals used popular offices to drive opponents into exile, weakening resistance within the Senate and making it easier for powerful leaders to pursue their plans. Despite earlier cooperation, distrust gradually appeared among the partners. Political agitation and personal rivalry created new tensions, and efforts were made to repair the alliance through renewed agreements and shared offices. For a time, these arrangements preserved a measure of unity and allowed the alliance to continue. The balance did not last. A marriage that had helped unite the leading families ended with the death of a key figure, removing an important bond between the partners. Violence erupted in the streets of Rome, and emergency powers were granted to restore order. Meanwhile, a military campaign in the east ended in disaster when one of the alliance's members was killed in battle. The partnership that had once dominated Roman politics was reduced to 2 rivals whose interests increasingly diverged. One of these men remained in Italy and gained growing influence over public affairs, while the other continued his campaigns abroad. As time passed, the Senate began to consider whether the absent commander should be recalled from his province. Although the proposal failed, new decisions required both rivals to contribute troops for service in the east. Through a technical maneuver, one commander lost 2 legions that had previously served under his authority, deepening the sense of mistrust between them. Political divisions hardened as leading officials openly sided with one faction. Military command within Italy was placed under the control of one rival, creating a clear imbalance of power. The opposing commander concluded that his position was becoming unsafe. After completing his campaigns and reorganizing the conquered territories, he made a fateful decision that would transform the political crisis into open war. Defying long-established custom, he led his army across the boundary river that separated his province from Italy. This act signaled the beginning of civil conflict. In terms of resources and political support, his opponent held many advantages. Large territories and naval forces remained under his control, while the invading commander relied mainly on hardened troops who had served under him for years. The presence of experienced legions inside Italy proved decisive in the early stages of the war. Veteran soldiers advanced rapidly, despite the winter season, and additional forces joined them along the way. Political leaders and senators abandoned the capital, leaving little organized resistance. Their commander withdrew step by step toward the eastern provinces, seeking a more favorable position from which to continue the struggle. With Italy secured, the invading general turned westward to eliminate remaining opposition and bring important regions under his control. Before long, he returned to Rome, where uncertain elections required temporary, emergency authority to restore order. This special command lasted only a short time and was soon relinquished once normal political procedures resumed. Shortly afterward, he was elected to the highest office for the coming year. Pompey believed the war could still be decided by weight of numbers and prestige. He had more men, deeper supplies, and strong support among Rome's traditional elites. When the armies finally met on the plains of Thessaly, he chose to force the issue. What followed was not a clean contest of strategy, but a grinding day of slaughter. The kind of battle that leaves the ground soaked, the air thick with dust, and entire units simply erased. Caesar's soldiers, hardened by years of campaigning, held their line with a discipline that mattered more than raw totals. Caesar also understood something Pompey did not. In civil war, morale can be sharper than steel. When Pompey's front began to buckle, the collapse spread fast. Panic does not move like a man, it moves like fire. Against expectations, Caesar won decisively. Pompey's cause disintegrated in the wake of the defeat, and he fled east, aiming for Egypt, where he expected refuge and resources. Egypt was ruled by a young king, Ptolemy, in a court already full of fear, rivalries, and sudden decisions made for survival. Pompey had once supported the dynasty, but loyalty meant little when the balance of power shifted. The people around Ptolemy calculated that the safest move was to please the victor rather than shelter the loser. Pompey was killed soon after arriving, an end that shocked even those who had opposed him. Whatever his political choices, he had been one of the most famous Romans of his age, and his death marked the closing of one chapter of the Republic's long breakdown. Pompey's reputation did not vanish with him. Many Romans remembered him as a capable commander and a gifted organizer, a man who could impose order on chaos and make the machinery of government work. His defenders argue that he had been pushed into conflict as much by circumstance and fear as by ambition, and that he believed the old system could still be protected if dangerous power was contained. Yet history also shows his limits. Pompey could be brilliant, but he often hesitated at the moment when decisive imagination was needed. Against Caesar, who combined speed, nerve, and political instinct, Pompey's caution became a weakness. With his rival removed, Caesar turned to Egypt not as a tourist in a romantic story, but as a commander who could not afford instability in a strategically vital kingdom. Egypt was wealthy, its grain mattered, and its politics could spill into Rome's civil conflict. The royal court was split between Ptolemy and Cleopatra, who were linked by dynasty and locked in a struggle for control. Cleopatra proved to be far more than a symbol or a beauty from legend. She was intelligent, ambitious, and politically sharp, someone who understood how power worked and how quickly it could be lost. Caesar aligned himself with her, and for a time Egypt became another theatre of crisis management, where diplomacy and military pressure had to work together. Even after gaining the upper hand in Egypt, Caesar could not simply return to Rome and declare the war finished. Rome's empire was large, and the aftershocks of civil conflict were everywhere. In Asia Minor, a new challenge flared when a regional ruler tried to take advantage of Roman distraction. Caesar moved quickly, crushing the threat in a campaign remembered for its speed and finality. The message was clear. Rome still had a center of gravity, and Caesar was it. Back in Italy, the old republican structure still existed on paper. Elections, offices, and official titles continued, because Romans had a deep cultural allergy to kingship. The city had expelled its kings centuries earlier, and the word king still carried the stink of tyranny. Caesar understood this sensitivity. Instead of openly claiming a crown, he accepted extraordinary authority wrapped in legal forms. He took emergency powers that were technically permitted in Rome's tradition, but he held them longer and used them more broadly than anyone could ignore. Step by step, the Republic's outward skin remained, while its inner balance shifted. As Caesar spent time away dealing with unfinished enemies and distant crises, someone had to manage the capital. That role fell to Mark Antony, Caesar's close associate and leading lieutenant. Antony was a product of Rome's political culture. Ambitious, experienced, and comfortable with power, he served as Caesar's deputy and became a key figure in the city's day-to-day control, especially when Caesar was absent. During these years, Caesar's dominance became unmistakable. He secured repeated high offices, combined titles, and steadily moved toward a position where no rival could challenge him. At the same time, Caesar pursued domestic reforms. Some were practical and popular. Among the most lasting was a restructuring of the calendar, an administrative change that revealed something important about Caesar's rule. He was not only a war leader, he was also reshaping how the Roman state functioned, how it counted time, how it managed civic life, and how it projected stability. These reforms helped many Romans accept his dominance as a price worth paying after years of bloodshed. But power in Rome was never only about usefulness. It was also about dignity, tradition, and the belief that no single man should stand above the collective authority of Senate and people. As Caesar's position grew, suspicion grew with it. Some Romans believed he was building a monarchy in everything but name. Others feared the example he set. If Caesar could become a permanent ruler, then the Republic had effectively become a stage prop. Even people who admired Caesar's genius could still fear what his success meant for Rome's political future. There were moments when Caesar seemed to test the limits of Roman tolerance. Public ceremonies and honours multiplied. Symbols of special status appeared. Supporters treated him as a figure above ordinary politics. Caesar sometimes refused the language of monarchy, but his refusal did not calm everyone. Opponents argued that a man who must repeatedly demonstrate he is not a king is already too close to the line. Whether Caesar desired a crown is still debated, but one fact is not. Many Romans believed his power had become dangerous, and belief alone can create action. A conspiracy formed among senators and leading men who convinced themselves that the only remedy was violence. They called themselves defenders of liberty, and some may have sincerely believed that killing Caesar would restore the Republic's balance. Others were driven by fear, wounded pride, and the humiliations of being sidelined. The group grew large, and its members took advantage of Caesar's confidence and his willingness to appear in public without the kind of personal security a modern ruler would never abandon. On the Ides of March, Caesar went to a meeting of the Senate. The attack was close, sudden, and personal. The assassins crowded in, blades hidden, and struck repeatedly until the dictator fell. The scene was chaotic and brutal, less heroic than later drama would suggest. In a matter of moments, the most powerful man in the Roman world was dead on the floor of a political chamber. The The conspirators had achieved their immediate goal. They had removed the central figure of the new order. But they had not solved the problem that had produced Caesar in the first place. Rome was not a small city-state anymore. It was a vast empire, and its politics had been bent for decades by armies, wealth, provincial commands, and personal loyalty. Killing Caesar did not rewind history. It simply created a vacuum. In the hours and days that followed, the city's future was unclear. Mark Antony, as consul and Caesar's closest political partner, held legal authority and immediate influence. Another powerful figure, Lepidus, commanded troops and had his own ambitions. Meanwhile, the Senate was divided and the streets were volatile. Two camps began to harden. One side framed Caesar's death as a liberation from tyranny. The other treated it as the murder of a leader who had brought stability and reform. The split was not only political, it was emotional, and it ran through families, friendships, and institutions. Antony moved fast. He secured Caesar's papers and estate, gaining control over documents and decisions that could be used as weapons. He also brought military force into the city under the pretext of keeping order, because in Rome, political authority without soldiers was often just a speech. The Senate tried to find a compromise to avoid immediate civil war. An arrangement emerged. The assassins would not be hunted down at once. Caesar would be honoured with a public funeral, and the acts Caesar had issued while alive would remain valid. That decision mattered, because it preserved Caesar's political legacy and gave Antony room to claim continuity rather than rupture. Caesar's will added a new complication. It named his heir, a teenager and distant relative, Gaius Octavius, later known as Octavian. The will also promised gifts to the people of Rome, a detail that ensured the crowd would not treat Caesar as merely a tyrant. When the funeral came, the city did not remain calm. Antony used the occasion to shape public emotion, turning grief into rage and directing that rage toward the assassins. The mood in Rome shifted quickly, and the men who had imagined themselves celebrated as liberators found themselves threatened by the very public they claimed to serve. They fled the city to save themselves, taking with them the hope of a clean restoration of the old republic. With key conspirators gone, Antony's power expanded. He rewarded allies, positioned himself at the centre of political life, and cultivated military connections beyond Italy. He also pushed measures that favoured Caesar's veterans, because soldiers were a political constituency that could not be ignored. At the same time, he began to stretch the ambiguity of Caesar's legacy to his own advantage. If Caesar's acts were protected, then claiming to act in Caesar's name became a powerful tool. Then, Octavian arrived. He came to Italy from the Greek world where he had been preparing for military service, and he learned on the way that Caesar had adopted him as heir. He took Caesar's name to strengthen his legitimacy and stepped into Roman politics with a confidence that surprised older men. Octavian assumed that Antony would naturally support him, because both were connected to Caesar. Antony did not share that view. He saw the young heir not as a partner, but as a future rival. A new struggle began, not in open battle at first, but in control of money, documents, and loyalty. Antony resisted handing over assets that Octavian believed were his by right. At the same time, Antony secured new provincial power and manoeuvred for control of important military commands in the Western territories. He also held influence over legions already loyal to Caesar's memory. Even if official assignments shifted on paper, the real question was always the same. Which commander could make soldiers march? In this atmosphere, the Republic's restoration became more and more unlikely. The dictator was dead, but dictatorship as a political outcome remained on the table, because Rome's deeper problems were still present. The Senate hoped to balance forces against each other, but the balance was unstable. Cicero, one of the most famous voices of Republican tradition, watched Antony's rise with growing alarm. He had once believed that the assassination could open a path back to shared government. Instead, he saw power concentrating again, this time in Antony's hands, while a new contender, Octavian, gathered legitimacy and ambition like fuel. The fighting in northern Italy did not end Rome's crisis, it merely changed who held the armies. Near Mutina, in the corridor between the towns later known as Modena and Bologna, two sharp clashes broke out. The Senate's consular commanders, Hirtius and Pansa, tried to halt Antony's advance and keep control of the situation. The battles were costly, and both men died soon afterward. Their deaths left a dangerous reality on the ground. Octavian now commanded veteran legions with no senior magistrate above him in the field. In Roman politics, that kind of accident could become a revolution. Instead of treating Octavian as the Senate's saviour, many senators treated Antony's setback as proof that Caesar's killers had been justified. Rewards were handed out to the very men who had fled Rome after the assassination. Brutus was assigned a major command in Macedonia, Cassius was granted Syria, and Decimus Brutus was placed over the consular forces that Octavian expected to keep. Another major player, Sextus Pompeius, was given naval authority, adding yet another armed power centre to an already fractured republic. To Octavian, this looked less like gratitude and more like an attempt to strip him of the only leverage he possessed, the loyalty of soldiers. Antony, however, was far from finished. Even after his defeat in Italy, his network was strong. Lepidus remained aligned with him, and other commanders added weight to his cause. With those additional troops, Antony's influence spread across the western provinces and reached into Spain and Gaul. In the middle of this struggle, Decimus Brutus found himself isolated. His own soldiers drifted away, choosing stronger masters. He tried to escape toward the east, but he never made it. The civil wars had become a world where a famous name and a senatorial appointment could not protect anyone without loyal legions. By this point, Roman power was splintered into 4 armed camps. Antony and his allies held strength in the west. Octavian dominated Italy. Brutus and Cassius built a major base in the eastern provinces. Sextus Pompeius controlled the sea lanes, and the sea was not a side issue. Rome's population depended on grain shipments. Octavian understood the immediate problem. If the men who killed Caesar remained alive and organised in the east, they would always be a threat to Caesar's heir. Eliminating them required scale and cooperation. That meant making a temporary deal with Antony. A political reset followed. Legal measures were passed to rehabilitate Antony and Lepidus, while stripping protection from Brutus and Cassius and formally confirming Octavian's position as Caesar's successor. Then, the 3 strongmen met near Bologna and negotiated face to face. What emerged was not a private handshake, but a structured division of power. Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus bound themselves into a formal arrangement that gave them authority to govern and appoint officials without asking the Senate each time. Provinces were distributed like strategic assets. Antony took Gaul on the northern frontier. Lepidus received other western territories. Octavian was assigned regions tied to supply lines and naval routes, including critical islands. It was power sharing, but not the kind the Republic had once meant. This was a rule built for men with armies. With their partnership declared, the next move was inevitable. Antony and Octavian turned east to confront Brutus and Cassius. Those two were not helpless fugitives. They had years of experience, money sources in the provinces, and the ability to squeeze revenue from cities that feared losing everything. They gathered a formidable number of legions, supported by naval strength and ample supplies. Their strategy was simple. Avoid being forced into a reckless decision and let time drain their enemies. Supply, not courage, often decides wars. The showdown formed near Philippi, along the great road that cut across Macedonia. Brutus and Cassius chose ground that protected them. One camp sat with difficult high terrain at its back. The other leaned on marshland that seemed to block an easy approach. Their position invited a standoff. They could hold, wait, and force Antony and Octavian to spend men and food. They also had strong cavalry, giving them a mobile edge if the battle turned into a war of maneuver. Antony was not interested in waiting forever. He displayed his army as if ready to fight, testing the enemy's nerve. The Republicans did not bite, so he changed the geometry of the battlefield. While the main lines faced each other, work parties began creating a way through the marsh, building up a hidden approach that could outflank the defensive position. It was slow, unpleasant labour, but Roman war often turned on engineering as much as on swords. When the moment came, Antony struck across the newly accessible ground and hit the side that had been left too thinly held. One camp was taken. The fighting on the open plain was fierce, but the loss of the position shook confidence. In the confusion, Cassius concluded the worst. Believing the battle was lost and escape impossible, he ended his own life. Yet the battle was not a clean triumph for the triumvirs. At the same time, Brutus had driven hard against Octavian's side and broke into the opposing camp. Octavian survived, but the first clash at Philippi ended in a brutal stalemate, made tragic by Cassius's fatal misreading of events. Weeks later, the armies met again. Brutus still held advantages that mattered: supplies, access to the sea, and time. A patient commander might have stretched the war until the triumvir's position weakened. But soldiers do not always accept patience. Morale can demand action. Pressure from the ranks pushed Brutus into a second major engagement. At first, his right wing fought well, strengthened by cavalry and personal leadership. But the line had been extended to avoid being outflanked, and that created weakness in the centre. Antony exploited that weakness, broke through and rolled the battle inward. Once the centre was compromised, the fight became a collapse rather than a contest. Seeing the end, Brutus chose death over capture. With that decision, the last organised military defence of the old Republican cause was effectively crushed. The aftermath was severe. The victors were not gentle in settling accounts. Men associated with Caesar's murder were hunted down, and many were executed. The victors justified this as necessity, as revenge, and as order. To others, it looked like the Republic devouring itself. Whatever the moral framing, the political result was clear. The old system had lost its champions, and the Mediterranean now belonged to competing warlords who claimed legitimacy through victory. Even then, the triumvirs did not enjoy peace. One major rival remained outside their arrangement: Sextus Pompeius. He had a famous name, being Pompey's son, and he had survived the earlier civil wars when many Pompeians had not. That alone made him a magnet for the defeated. Men who had fought for Brutus and Cassius now drifted towards Sextus, not necessarily because of shared ideals, but because the sea offered refuge, and a fleet offered bargaining power. Sextus did not fit neatly into the old categories of Republican or Caesarian. He did not appear to be trying to restore the Senate's authority. He also did not seem eager to serve the triumvirs. His advantage was the sea itself. In a world where Rome depended on grain shipments, the commander who controlled the shipping lanes could make the capital hungry. Sextus built that leverage deliberately. By taking islands like Sicily and Sardinia and operating powerful squadrons, he positioned himself as a gatekeeper of Rome's food supply. Under pressure, the city could riot. Under panic, leaders could be forced to negotiate. For a brief time, negotiation worked. An agreement recognized Sextus's control over key islands and promised further rewards in exchange for safeguarding supplies and staying out of Italy. But the deal was unstable from the beginning. Promises were delayed. Trust eroded. A defection changed the balance when Sardinia shifted to Octavian's side. Around the same time, Octavian's personal alliances in Rome shifted as well, and the political temperature rose. Soon, the relationship between Octavian and Sextus turned from uneasy cooperation into open conflict. The first major naval fighting showed how uneven the contest still was. Sextus's crews were experienced sailors. His ships were fast and agile. Octavian's commanders struggled to match that skill at sea. In one engagement near the Italian coast, Sextus's forces pinned Octavian's ships close to shore, turning the fight into a violent contest of collision and boarding. A storm then punished the pursuers, wrecking ships and scattering formations. Sextus used the moment to project an image of mastery over the sea, because symbolism mattered as much as strategy. If Rome believed he ruled the waves, his bargaining power increased. Octavian understood the lesson. To beat Sextus, he needed a navy that could fight like a navy, not like an improvised convoy. For that task, he relied on Marcus Agrippa, a commander with rare competence, discipline, and technical imagination. Agrippa did not simply build ships. He built an entire naval system, a harbour complex, training grounds, and weapons designed for the specific problem of fighting small, nimble vessels. A protected naval base was created where crews could drill and where fleets could be built and launched quickly. The scale was enormous and the speed was astonishing. To man the oars, thousands of rowers were recruited, including large numbers freed specifically for service. Agrippa also invested in tools that could turn a sea battle into something Roman soldiers understood. Grappling devices that could seize enemy hulls, and improved missile support that punished lighter ships once the range closed. By the summer of the next campaign season, Octavian was ready to bring the war to Sicily. The plan aimed at pressure from multiple directions. One force would sail down from the new harbour base. Another would approach from Africa with troops for a landing in the west. Additional ships would support the landings and attempt to trap Sextus between converging attacks. Nature, however, does not respect plans. Storms scattered squadrons, delayed movements, and created gaps. In war at sea, weather can be an enemy as real as any commander. Octavian attempted a bold move, guessing that Sextus was concentrated in one area and that another key town might be vulnerable. He moved troops and ships quickly, trying to force a surrender and establish a foothold. Sextus read the intention and reacted fast. He arrived with a large fleet at the critical moment and struck while Octavian's men were still establishing camp. On land, Octavian's troops held with difficulty under pressure from cavalry. At sea, the result was worse. Many of Octavian's ships were destroyed or captured, and Octavian himself escaped only narrowly. It was the kind of defeat that could have ended the campaign if Octavian had been less stubborn or less protected by loyal subordinates. While Octavian recovered, Agrippa achieved the kind of success Octavian had been missing. He targeted island positions, disrupted Sextus's detachments, and forced fleet actions on ground of his choosing. When Sextus rushed to bring reinforcements, the battle became a clash of two styles of naval warfare. Sextus relied on speed, quick turns, and attacks aimed at oars and rudders, crippling enemy ships without needing to sink them. Agrippa relied on heavy hulls, ramming power, and height advantage. His crews were trained to throw missiles down, onto lower decks and then seize ships with grapples, turning sea fights into brutal boarding actions. Agrippa won the balance of these engagements, sinking or disabling many enemy vessels while losing relatively few. Yet Sextus was not destroyed. When his ships retreated into shallower waters, Agrippa's heavier fleet could not safely follow to finish the job. The sea offered Sextus escape routes that no land army could block. Even after setbacks, Sextus still held strong points across Sicily, and enough ships to keep fighting. He hoped one decisive blow would drive Octavian off the island and restore his leverage over Rome's food supply. Octavian responded with a combination of method and pressure. Agrippa seized key towns to build forward bases. Octavian brought overwhelming numbers, legions, cavalry, and light troops to secure landing zones and threaten supply centres. A failed push against one of Sextus's lieutenants forced Octavian's army into rough conditions. Soldiers camped without proper shelter under heavy rain, with the ominous glow of an active volcano visible in the distance. One of those scenes that feels like a warning from the world itself. Octavian pressed on anyway. The strategy shifted from chasing supply ships at sea to strangling supplies at their source on land. By taking the towns that fed Sextus's forces, Octavian aimed to force Sextus into the kind of decisive battle he could no longer avoid. That was the turning point in the logic of the war. Sextus could survive storms, escape into shallow water and win occasional sea fights. But if his bases began to fall and his provisioning collapsed, his fleet would become a weapon without fuel. Octavian's goal was simple: take away the island's support structure and compel Sextus to fight on terms that favoured Agrippa's heavier ships and Rome's disciplined soldiers. The final contest was now being set not only by ships and swords, but by harbours, grain stores, and the cold mathematics of logistics. Sextus Pompeius understood the situation better than most of his enemies. On land, Octavian's legions could grow endlessly stronger, while Sicily's towns could be taken one by one. At sea, however, Sextus still believed he held the advantage. His crews had years of experience, his captains knew the currents and coastal winds, and his ships were built for speed and tight manoeuvring. If the war was going to be decided in his favour, it had to be decided on open water, where skill could matter more than sheer numbers. So, Sextus pushed for a single, decisive fleet action. The challenge was direct: equal fleets, a fixed number of ships for both sides, and a set date. Octavian did not rush to accept. His recent history at sea had been mixed at best, and he knew that a naval defeat could undo months of planning. But refusing carried its own cost. A public rejection could look like weakness, and in Roman politics, appearing afraid could be more dangerous than the risk of battle itself. In the end, Octavian agreed, trusting that Agrippa's preparations had finally turned the tide. The fleets met off the Sicilian coast, within sight of land, arranged in long lines so wide that the battle would stretch across the horizon. This was not the kind of fighting where a single heroic charge ends the story. Naval war in this era was a slow storm of noise and violence. It began at range, with volleys of arrows and javelins, heavy stones flung from ship-mounted engines, and burning projectiles that could turn a wooden deck into an inferno. Then the ships closed. Ramming became the language of decision, the brutal attempt to smash a hull, snap oars, and cripple steering so an enemy vessel became helpless. For a long time, neither side could claim a clear upper hand. Ships slammed, backed away, and slammed again. Boarding parties leapt across the narrow gaps as hulls locked together. Officers shouted commands that vanished under the roar of collision and the screams of men falling into the sea in armour they could not swim in. The struggle was especially savage because the fighters were almost indistinguishable. This was Roman against Roman. They carried similar weapons, wore similar gear, and spoke the same language. In the confusion, even identifying the enemy could become difficult. Signals and watchwords were used to prevent friendly deaths. But once the fighting became chaotic, those safeguards could be copied, stolen, and turned into traps. The difference came from innovation and discipline. Agrippa had prepared weapons designed to change the nature of a sea battle. His grappling devices could seize enemy ships and drag them close, forcing the fight into a form that favoured Octavian's men. Sextus's sailors were excellent at manoeuvring, but manoeuvre means little when a ship is physically pulled into contact. Once the vessels were locked together, the battle became a contest of infantry skill on floating platforms, and Octavian's side generally had the better soldiers for that kind of work. Step by step, more of Sextus's ships were immobilized, boarded, and taken. By the end of the day, the pattern was clear. Octavian's fleet had suffered surprisingly light losses in sunk ships, while Sextus's losses were heavier and more damaging in every sense. Some of Sextus's vessels fled. Some were driven ashore, some were burned, and others surrendered when the crews realized there was no path through the crushing press of enemy ships. The battle did not merely wound Sextus Pompeius, it shattered the foundation of his power. Without sea control, Sicily was no longer a fortress. It was a trap. Sextus tried to salvage what he could. He rushed toward Messana, hoping to gather troops and regroup, but the political reality of defeat hit him immediately. Defection spread. Loyal men became cautious, cautious men became absent, and absent men became traitors. Sextus had to move carefully, slipping in quietly, collecting what remained of his resources and escaping eastward. He aimed for the territories dominated by Antony, hoping that Antony's rivalry with Octavian might make him a useful asset rather than a condemned enemy. Octavian did not pursue him with full force. Instead, Lepidus and Agrippa secured key points in Sicily, while Octavian stayed to consolidate the victory. This decision was calculated. Chasing Sextus deep into another leader's sphere could create complications, and Octavian was already thinking beyond Sicily. Sextus's defeat had eliminated one rival, but it also removed a buffer that had kept the triumvirs from turning on one another. The political chessboard was being cleared, and the remaining pieces were heavier. In the east, Sextus attempted a last recovery. He raised a small army and tried to defend himself against the commanders operating under Antony's authority. But the momentum of history was against him. Allies drifted away, resources were limited, and the reputation of being a defeated man is often fatal in a world ruled by confidence. Eventually, Sextus was captured and executed. With that, the last major independent challenger to the triumvir's control was gone. Now, the conflict narrowed toward its final shape. Two giants remained, Octavian in the west and Antony in the east. By the early 30s before Christ, Antony had turned the eastern provinces into a structured power base. He relied on local kings and rulers who were willing to cooperate with Rome, adjusting boundaries and strengthening friendly regimes to stabilize the region. His generals won victories that helped secure his position. Administratively, Antony could present himself as an effective manager of a vast domain, someone capable of holding the East together. Yet one problem lingered like an old wound: Parthia. Years earlier, Rome had suffered a humiliating defeat there, losing not only men but also military symbols that carried enormous psychological weight. Recovering those lost standards would have been a powerful political achievement, the sort that could silence critics and cement authority. Antony pursued the opportunity when internal tensions in Parthia appeared to create an opening. But the campaign did not deliver the triumph he wanted. Losses were heavy, conditions were punishing, and the symbolic prize remained out of reach. In the end, the expedition weakened Antony's prestige more than it strengthened it. To compensate, Antony turned toward Armenia. That campaign succeeded quickly. The Armenian king was seized, the region was subdued, and an occupation was established. It was a victory, but it did not erase the shadow of Parthia. Antony still needed a story that made him look larger than his setbacks, and that desire shaped what came next. In Alexandria, Antony staged a celebration that broadcast a message. The East was not merely a set of provinces to be administered, but a courtly world where power could be displayed through spectacle. He paraded spoils, honoured local religious traditions, and presented himself as a ruler who could command both Roman force and Eastern wealth. He then distributed territories to Cleopatra and to the children connected to his household. These grants were politically explosive, not only because of what they transferred, but because of the image they created. Roman power appearing to flow outward from Alexandria, rather than from Rome itself. Octavian saw the opening immediately. The smartest move was not to attack Antony head-on at first, because Antony still had supporters in the Senate, and could claim long service to Rome. Instead, Octavian framed the story around Cleopatra. By making Cleopatra the central threat, Octavian could present the coming conflict as a defense of Rome against foreign influence, rather than a civil war against a fellow Roman. It was a narrative designed to attract broader support. Easier to unite Romans against an external enemy than against one another. At the same time, Octavian strengthened his position in the most practical way possible: victory, money, and construction. Military successes in the West increased his resources. He used those resources to improve daily life in Rome, funding repairs, building projects, and visible upgrades to the city's infrastructure. Water systems, sewers, public buildings, and temples gained attention. This mattered because politics in Rome was not only argued in speeches, it was felt in streets, markets, and neighborhoods. A leader who made the city function could build loyalty without needing to beg for it. As the year 32 before Christ approached, the relationship between Octavian and Antony moved from rivalry into open rupture. The formal framework that had once legalized their power sharing was fading, and the legal ground under Octavian's authority inside Italy was not as secure as it looked from the outside. Antony, ruling from Alexandria with massive resources, continued operating as if nothing had changed. Octavian, by contrast, needed Rome itself, the Senate, public sentiment, and the appearance of legitimacy, to prevent the political centre from sliding away. The consuls in Rome that year leaned toward Antony. Opposition against Octavian became louder and more direct. Motions were raised, accusations flew, and Octavian found himself challenged in the very arena he had been carefully cultivating. His response was not to retreat permanently, but to return with visible protection. A military escort in the capital sent a message without requiring a single shouted threat. Rome's politics now lived under the shadow of force. The backlash was immediate. Leading officials and a significant group of senators fled to Antony, creating something close to a rival political community. Antony encouraged the image of a legitimate Senate operating outside Octavian's reach, while Octavian responded by painting Antony's camp as corrupted by Eastern luxury and court politics. Both sides fought a war of reputation before they fought a war with ships and swords. Antony's personal choices made this struggle easier for Octavian. Antony lived openly with Cleopatra and eventually divorced Octavian's sister, Octavia. That act was not merely private, it was political. It severed a symbolic link between the two camps and allowed Octavian to present the conflict as a question of loyalty and identity. Antony's supporters advised moves that might soften public reaction. but Antony chose to keep Cleopatra close, believing her presence mattered for morale, money, and the unity of his Eastern coalition. Then came the moment that shifted the balance of perception. Two men from Antony's circle changed sides and revealed the existence and location of Antony's will. Octavian took the extraordinary step of making its contents public. Whether this action was legal or appropriate mattered less than the effect. The will suggested a future rooted in Alexandria rather than Rome, and reinforced the story Octavian wanted Romans to believe: that Antony's centre of gravity had moved away from the Republic's traditions and toward an Eastern monarchy in all but name. With public opinion increasingly prepared, Octavian guided the next step carefully. Rather than declaring war on Antony directly, the conflict was framed against Cleopatra, presented as an enemy of Rome. This framing allowed Octavian to claim that he was defending Rome's values and sovereignty, not simply fighting another Roman for personal power. Rituals and public ceremonies reinforced the message that the state itself was preparing for an external war, even though everyone understood that Antony's forces would be the real opposition. In the earliest centuries of the Republic, Rome was not a maritime state. The city's wealth came from fields, herds, and local trade, and much of what arrived by sea could be handled by foreign merchants without requiring Rome to build a navy of its own. Expansion, when it came, was expected to happen across land, not water. Italy was the battleground. If neighbouring peoples resisted Rome's rise, legions could march, fight, and impose terms. Even the most feared external danger in those early days came from the north, where raiders and migrating war bands threatened Roman territory. That threat demanded armies, not fleets. At the same time, the Western Mediterranean already had a dominant sea power: Carthage, a wealthy city on the North African coast. Carthage's strength was commercial and naval, built on harbours, shipping networks, and fortified ports scattered across key routes. It held influence in Spain and North Africa and reached into the islands that mattered most for controlling sea lanes. For a long time, Rome and Carthage found ways to coexist. Agreements limited where Romans could sail, and in return Carthage avoided direct attacks on Italy. The arrangement worked because Rome did not yet insist on projecting power far beyond the peninsula. That balance cracked when Sicily became a prize worth fighting over. Sicily was not just a beautiful island. It was fertile, positioned in the middle of vital routes, and filled with strategic ports. Around the same time, Rome's horizons changed in southern Italy. When Pyrrhus of Epirus invaded, Rome fought a hard war to hold its ground and eventually gained dominance over Greek-speaking communities along the coast. Those coastal cities lived by seafaring traditions, and their presence pushed Rome toward a realization it could no longer avoid. Control of coastlines meant little without control of waters. The immediate spark that drew Rome into Sicily came from a complicated local conflict. A group of mercenaries had seized control of Messana, a port city that sat on the narrow crossing between Sicily and Italy. When the ruler of Syracuse moved to reclaim it, the mercenaries panicked and appealed for help from both Carthage and Rome. Carthage responded quickly and placed forces into the city, treating the request as an invitation to expand. Rome hesitated, but the political pressure to act grew. Intervention promised influence, and in Roman politics, opportunity rarely waited for perfect certainty. Rome committed itself to the gamble. The problem was simple. Rome had no serious navy. Roman troops crossed the straits in improvised vessels and entered a conflict already shaped by naval power. The Romans drove out the Carthaginian garrison and held the city, and Carthage responded by broadening the war. Alliances shifted, and fighting spread across the island. Roman forces performed better than outsiders expected, and confidence rose. the Senate began to think in larger terms. If Sicily could be won, then Carthage could be pushed back. Yet winning Sicily required something Rome still lacked: ships in large numbers and crews trained to fight at sea. So Rome built a fleet from scratch. Early Roman sea power was small, a handful of lighter warships, supplemented by allied contingents. That would not be enough. The state commissioned a far larger construction program, including heavier vessels capable of carrying more men and delivering more force in ramming and boarding. The speed of the undertaking was extraordinary, driven by urgency, manpower, and the blunt reality that Rome could not afford to be outclassed at sea if it wanted Sicily. Thousands of workers would have been required to cut timber, shape hulls, forge fittings, and assemble vessels quickly enough to matter. It was a national mobilization, not a quiet shipyard project. The struggle with Carthage dragged on for decades, and while many famous episodes later unfolded on land, naval power remained essential. Fleets transported armies, protected supply lines, and created opportunities to strike where the enemy least expected. Large fleet battles decided moments that armies alone could not. After Carthage's final defeat, and with other major maritime rivals weakened, Rome's navy lost some urgency. The Mediterranean began to look less like a contested ocean and more like a highway Rome assumed it could police when needed. For a time, naval power declined in priority. That changed again in the last century of the Republic. Civil conflict and distant campaigns forced Rome to rely on ships for transport and strategic reach. Commanders rebuilt fleets when their plans required it. By the time Octavian began moving toward a final showdown with Antony and Cleopatra, naval strength was not optional. It was the battlefield itself. Octavian inherited a complicated situation. Earlier fleets had been diverted into the hands of rival commanders during the civil wars, and one sea warlord, in particular, had taken control of a significant portion of Rome's naval resources. To defeat that rival, Octavian and his closest naval commander, Agrippa, built a fleet designed for combat rather than prestige. That fleet survived the earlier sea war and became a foundation for what was coming next. Even so, a larger confrontation required more ships and more trained men. The warships Octavian relied upon were not the fantasy galleys of modern imagination. They were practical machines built around rowing power. Sails existed and could be used in movement, but in battle the decisive engine was the oar. Below deck, rowers sat in tiers, working in coordinated rhythm to drive the ship forward, to brake, to pivot, and to surge at the moment of impact. These were trained crews, not disposable captives chained to benches. A battle galley needed disciplined rowers because a single mistimed stroke could ruin a turn, expose the ship's flank, or dull the force of a ram. A typical fighting vessel carried multiple kinds of manpower: rowers below, sailors to manage the ship's operations, and soldiers above, stationed on deck to throw missiles and board enemy hulls. The bow carried a reinforced ram designed to punch into the enemy's side. Towers and raised platforms could be used to gain height, give better angles for throwing weapons, and protect men who needed to fight while the ships were pressed close together. In naval warfare of this period, the line between sea battle and land battle was thin. Once ships locked, it became infantry fighting on cramped planks, with the sea waiting to swallow anyone who slipped. With those realities in mind, the final campaign took shape. By late 32 before Christ, Antony positioned his forces around Actium at the mouth of the Ambracian Gulf. It was a place chosen for strategy. The surrounding coastline offered harbours and staging points. The strait could be controlled by towers, guard ships, and barriers that allowed friendly movement while complicating enemy approach. Antony knew Italy was politically secure for Octavian, but the east was his strength. He expected that his experience, his resources, and his larger coalition could create an opening. Antony's initial advantage was scale. He had more ships and more men at the start of the campaign, and that allowed him to spread forces along the approach routes. The logic was straightforward. If Octavian's ships were caught while overloaded with troops and supplies, they would be slower and less responsive. A surprise hit at the wrong moment could cripple a fleet before it even reached the battlefield. Harassment, ambush, and disruption were the best ways to exploit numerical advantage without risking everything in one gamble. Winter turned the region into a chessboard. Camps were set, scouts watched coastlines, and smaller operations tested reactions. Storms mattered as much as plans. At one point, Octavian attempted to move early and was forced back by bad weather. Agrippa proved more aggressive and more effective, taking key positions and tightening pressure on Antony's network of ports. These were not glamorous victories, but they were the kind that decide campaigns. Every seized harbour meant safer resupply for one side and fewer options for the other. Octavian eventually established a strong position near Actium, taking ground that allowed surveillance of both land and sea. Antony held the inner space of the Gulf and arranged his fleet along the strait, fortifying the mouth and creating a controlled entry. Yet Antony's camp faced problems that no wall could fully solve. Supplies and water were limited. Summer heat made sanitation difficult, and disease began to eat away at strength and morale. Octavian's camp was better supplied and better placed. His side could maintain a blockade that restricted Antony's movement, while still bringing in necessities through controlled channels. As weeks passed, Antony's political position also began to fray. Allied rulers and local power brokers watched the trend and began calculating survival. Some were defeated, some were removed, and some simply changed sides when they concluded that Octavian was becoming the safer bet. Even within Antony's Roman command structure, defections appeared. Every defection was more than a manpower loss. It was a public signal that confidence was shifting. There were moments when Antony's commanders showed they could still strike. One admiral managed a surprise attack under cover of mist, scattering a portion of the opposing fleet at a vulnerable moment. But the advantage could not be fully exploited, because Agrippa arrived quickly and cut off pursuit. The opportunity dissolved, and the wider strategic pressure remained unchanged. By the end of summer, Antony's choices narrowed. Supplies were strained, disease had taken a toll, and the blockade tightened. The question became whether to force a breakout, seek a decisive battle, or attempt a move toward Egypt, where resources and political sanctuary might still exist. Evidence suggests that Antony's fleet was prepared for more than one outcome. A commander facing such pressure often prepares for both victory and escape, because committing to only one plan can be fatal if the battle turns unexpectedly. When the day of decision arrived, the sea was calm enough to allow a full fleet action. Both sides sailed into position early and waited for the conditions that would best serve their tactics. In naval warfare, wind is not background scenery. It can be the difference between control and helpless drift. The fleets delayed, watching the sky and the water, timing their first moves to the expected shift that would influence how ships could turn, accelerate, and avoid being driven toward shore. The exact numbers present are hard to pin down because disease, desertion, and detachments affected strength. What matters is that both sides fielded fleets, large enough to form long lines, spanning thousands of yards. Antony deployed his squadrons in organised blocks, keeping Cleopatra's contingent positioned behind, as a reserve and as a protected element of the formation. That rear position was not necessarily a sign of fear. In some traditions, it was a place reserved for elite units, and for safeguarding the core of the fleet. Octavian's fleet formed farther out at sea in a broad curve designed to prevent flanking. His line had to be longer because of its position and because a curved formation reduces the risk of being wrapped from the side. Commanders placed themselves where Roman custom preferred. On the right wing, the position associated with honour and direct control over key manoeuvres. Antony held the northern end of the line, a place that allowed him to attempt an outflanking move and coordinate the turning of his formation with the wind. Octavian stayed on the opposite end, while Agrippa held a critical sector where naval skill would be most tested. The battle line at Actium did not stay still for long. Both fleets began drifting northward as commanders tried to win the same advantage: space on the flank. The movement was not a silent repositioning. It produced constant clashes because each side fought in a different way and built its tactics around the strengths of its ships. Octavian's squadrons relied on speed and repeat attacks. Their vessels were lighter, easier to turn, and quicker to accelerate. Instead of locking into prolonged grappling fights, they surged forward to strike, backed away before they could be trapped, and then returned again. Sometimes against the same target, sometimes against another ship that had become exposed in the confusion. It was a style built on pressure and rhythm. Hit, withdraw, hit again, always looking for a weak point. Antony's heavier ships answered with a different approach. They tried to stop the rushes with dense missile fire and with iron hooks thrown to seize an attacker and drag it in close. When that worked, the fight shifted instantly into boarding and close combat, where a big hull and a high deck could become an advantage. But this method carried risk. Miss the moment. Fail to catch the lighter ships and the larger vessels became targets, too slow to escape, too broad to avoid a ram, and too vulnerable once their formation began to loosen. That loosening mattered. Antony's northern wing had fewer ships than the opposing arc. To protect the flank and keep contact with the enemy's movement, more of his vessels were pulled out of the central mass. A gap opened where a gap could not be afforded. Octavian's centre, seeing the opportunity, pressed in. In a naval battle, the collapse rarely begins with a single dramatic blow. It begins when the middle becomes turbulent, when orders cannot travel cleanly across the line, and when ships lose the spacing that keeps them from colliding with allies as well as enemies. By afternoon, the expected winds arrived. The sea grew rougher, the line became more scattered, and visibility across the centre worsened. In that unstable moment, Cleopatra's squadron moved. Some observers later treated it as flight. Others argued it may have begun as a deliberate push through an opening, a manoeuvre that became a breakout once the chance presented itself. The truth is difficult to pin down. What is clear is that her ships found room to slip through the disrupted centre. Antony followed. He transferred from a slow flagship to a smaller vessel, better suited to speed, and joined the movement toward open water. Whether this was a plan prepared in advance or a decision made under pressure, the result was the same. The battle changed character. With Antony and Cleopatra pulling away, the remaining fleet faced a crisis of leadership and morale. Ships that had expected to fight under direct command were now left to interpret the situation on their own. And in a civil conflict, uncertainty spreads faster than courage. By late afternoon, the engagement was effectively decided. Octavian's side captured a large number of ships, and many crews surrendered once it became clear the centre was gone and the command structure had broken. On land, the army that had been assembled to support the fleet reached a grim conclusion. Without control of the sea, there was no secure path forward. Negotiations ended in surrender, and Octavian had reason to be careful in what came next. Mercy could be useful. A victor who offered clemency could turn former enemies into assets and reduce the need for continued bloodshed. Actium was later remembered as a world-changing naval triumph, and in political memory it became larger than life. In reality, it also had an awkward edge. Antony and Cleopatra had escaped. Octavian had won the battlefield, but the central figures of the enemy coalition were still alive. The final act would have to be fought somewhere else. Pursuit across the open sea was not simple. Octavian's lighter ships were excellent in battle, but not every vessel was equipped for long-distance chasing in unpredictable conditions. More importantly, there was little advantage in racing immediately after the fleeing squadron when the entire eastern system still needed to be secured. Octavian first moved to lock down the provinces that had been loyal to Antony. That task proved easier than expected. Many of Antony's forces had been concentrated at Actium or shifted toward Egypt, and with the outcome now obvious, local leaders began choosing stability over loyalty. Back in Italy, the victory strengthened Octavian's position further. The public had already been steered toward his side, and Antony's retreat toward Egypt seemed to confirm the narrative that Octavian had been pushing, that his rival had drifted away from Roman political life and had tied his fate to an eastern court. Even so, the home front was not without tension. Years of warfare had produced waves of veterans returning to claim land and rewards. Land was limited, confiscation risked new unrest, and Octavian needed a solution that would not reopen old wounds. He leaned toward purchase and settlement planning, knowing that the wealth required to stabilize Italy could be drawn from the east once the final campaign was finished. Near the end of the year, with the provinces largely secured, Octavian returned briefly to Rome to organize resources and reinforce legitimacy. Celebrations followed, and opposition, what little remained, had little room to maneuver. The political contest had become a matter of power, and the winning side now held the center. Early in the next year, Octavian moved toward Egypt. The approach was deliberate. Part of the force came by sea, then advanced by land toward Alexandria, while another commander moved in from the west to tighten the net. Octavian also kept pressure on Cleopatra through messages and negotiations. These contacts could serve several purposes at once: gathering intelligence, creating delay inside Alexandria, and encouraging mistrust between Antony and Cleopatra. Even if no genuine deal was ever intended, the uncertainty itself could weaken the enemy's ability to act. When the final confrontation reached Alexandria, it unfolded quickly. Antony's naval forces did not present a strong resistance. Key elements surrendered and mounted troops followed suit. Once that happened, the remaining infantry had little chance of changing the outcome. Antony, seeing the collapse, withdrew into the city. In such moments, suspicion becomes lethal. He believed betrayal had occurred, and that belief drove him toward desperation. The end of Antony came amid confusion, misinformation, and irreversible decisions. He chose death rather than capture. The act did not immediately kill him, and his final hours became a scene of grief, urgency, and human breakdown as Cleopatra's household tried to manage a situation that had already escaped control. The political war had become personal tragedy. Cleopatra's position was different. Octavian wanted her alive. A captured queen could become the most powerful symbol of victory imaginable, a living proof that the struggle was finished. Cleopatra understood that danger. If she lived, she could be displayed. If she died, she could deny Octavian that final spectacle. Under guard and increasingly isolated, she prepared a way out. Her death has never been fully clear even to ancient observers. Accounts differed, rumours multiplied, and later, retellings turned uncertainty into legend. What matters historically is the result. Cleopatra died in captivity, and Octavian did not get the public triumph he wanted, in the form he wanted it. With Cleopatra gone and Antony dead, Egypt's wealth and political independence collapsed into Roman hands. the region did not become just another province in the usual sense. Octavian treated it as a special possession, a source of revenue and leverage that strengthened his personal control. Administration was placed under a trusted governor, and the flow of resources now moved toward the victor. Octavian's return to Rome in the summer of 29 BCE was staged as more than a victory lap. It was a carefully designed public reset after years of civil war, combining ceremonial spectacle with practical reforms that made his authority feel both inevitable and legitimate. The celebrations unfolded across 3 days, each one carrying its own message. The opening day highlighted earlier successes from the northern campaigns, victories that had already been acknowledged in the past but were now brought back into the spotlight for a reason. By linking old achievements to the recent end of the wars, Octavian framed his rise as a long, steady record of service, rather than a sudden grab for power. The later days focused on the decisive struggle that had ended the rivalry for control of the Roman world. Yet even here the presentation was selective. Instead of presenting the conflict as Romans destroying Romans, the public story leaned toward the defeat of a foreign monarch and the end of an external threat. That emphasis helped soften an uncomfortable reality. The final victory had come out of a civil conflict, and Rome was still full of families who had fought on different sides. The most dramatic images of the procession underlined that foreign theme: Egyptian wealth, Eastern luxury, the sense that Rome had not merely won a war but had secured the Mediterranean's richest prize. The scale of the spectacle was vast, and so was the spending. Octavian turned victory into public benefit in the simplest way possible: direct cash distributions and visible generosity. It was not charity. It was political engineering. Money and celebration gave ordinary Romans a personal reason to associate his rule with relief, reward, and stability. Once the festivals ended, the real work began. Octavian moved quickly to signal that the age of emergency was closing. One of the strongest symbolic gestures was a public declaration that Rome had stepped out of wartime footing. He followed symbolism with policy. The army was reduced, and veterans were settled in colonies. Instead of letting demobilization become another round of land seizures and resentment, land was purchased, where possible, to avoid reopening old wounds. That approach also carried a second message. The state no longer needed limitless armed men to enforce order, because order had returned. He then turned to the machinery of government itself. A census was organized, the Senate's membership was cut down, and the body was restructured so it looked more disciplined, more serious, and less bloated by years of crisis politics. Octavian placed himself at the center of this restored institution, not as a king on a throne, but as the leading man in a supposedly renewed republic. He stayed in Rome for an extended period and held the consulship again, giving these changes a sense of legality and routine. Everything about this phase was cautious by design. Julius Caesar's fate was a warning that could not be ignored. Octavian avoided the image of open dictatorship and instead built something subtler. Power that could be described as constitutional, familiar, and even traditional, while still giving him the final say on the empire's direction. In 27 BCE, a theatrical moment made that strategy clear. Octavian formally handed back major powers and provinces to the Senate, as if stepping away from extraordinary authority. The Senate then returned control of the most important commands to him. The gesture allowed both sides to claim a principle. The Senate could say it had restored the Republic's proper order, while Octavian emerged with the strongest position in the state and a new honorific name that marked him as more than an ordinary politician. Rome was watching a transfer of power that looked voluntary, even though the outcome was never in doubt. succession soon became the quiet problem behind the public success. Octavian was often unwell, and the question of who would inherit the system mattered because the system now rested on one person more than any law could admit. A promising young relative was elevated through marriage politics and rapid advancement, and the court's attention shifted toward grooming the next generation. Then came the shock of 23 BCE. Augustus fell dangerously ill, and the city experienced a moment of uncertainty that revealed how much depended on his survival. He recovered, but the heir apparent died soon after. The loss forced a recalculation, and Augustus turned to the trusted man who had repeatedly proven indispensable in war and administration. Personal alliances and marriages became tools of state, not gossip of the aristocracy. In this new world, family ties were politics. That same year also exposed another reality. Republican sentiment had not vanished. A plot formed, and even if it lacked the strength to truly overturn the regime, it showed that some Romans still dreamed of the older order. The response was harsh, and after it was finished, Augustus made a move that looked modest. He stepped back from holding the consulship year after year. But the effect was the opposite of modest. The Senate compensated him with powers that were broader, more flexible, and more enduring than the consulship ever was. His command authority was strengthened beyond that of any other provincial governor and was recognized as valid across the empire. On top of that, he received the key civic power that made him dominant inside Rome itself. Authority that allowed him to guide legislation, block rivals, and direct policy without needing to hold the city's traditional offices. By surrendering one symbol of power, he gained a structure of power that was harder to challenge. From this point on, the regime no longer depended on yearly elections to function. The Principate had matured into a durable imperial system. In the years that followed, Augustus alternated between travel and consolidation. Diplomatic achievements in the East carried enormous prestige, especially anything that repaired old humiliations and restored Roman honour without another catastrophic war. Later, campaigns and inspections in the West reinforced the image of an emperor who guarded the frontiers and understood the provinces. When he returned, monumental building and public ceremony translated foreign success into domestic pride. Peace became the brand of the age, not peace as weakness, but peace as the reward for victory and the guarantee of prosperity. Augustus supported monuments that celebrated stability and presented his rule as a blessing that had replaced chaos. Yet the true foundation of this peace was administrative control. Reliable taxation, disciplined provincial governance, and a state that could enforce decisions without constant civil conflict. His domestic program reached into law, courts, and social behaviour. Corruption and bribery were targeted, and provincial justice was standardised so that the empire felt less like a collection of private fiefdoms. Appeals increasingly led upward until the emperor stood as the final referee. Alongside that came moral legislation. Augustus promoted the traditional family as a public ideal and backed laws that punished adultery and reshaped marriage expectations. The message was clear. The state had the right to regulate private behaviour in the name of public stability. Even the emperor's household was not immune to scandal, and enforcement could be brutal when politics demanded an example. Financially, the Principate became more efficient than the late Republic. Provinces were expected to fund themselves, and the imperial government developed steady revenue streams through taxes and controlled resources. Augustus also held practical dominance over precious metals and minting, and coinage spread his image and authority across the Mediterranean more effectively than any speech. Every marketplace became a place where imperial legitimacy was silently repeated. Rome itself changed shape. Poverty remained real, but it existed beside an expanding landscape of public projects. Forums, temples, roads, aqueducts, repairs, and new construction that made daily life more functional and the city more magnificent. Administration was not just paperwork, it was stone, water, and order. Culture flourished in the shadow of power. Augustus and his closest allies supported writers who gave the age its voice. Poetry and history turned Rome's past into a grand narrative that made the new order feel like destiny. The arts were not simply decoration. They were a way to teach Romans what the regime wanted them to believe about themselves. That after suffering and division, they had reached a restored golden balance of strength and peace. Augustus died in 14 CE. His funeral was immense, his memory was elevated into sacred status, and the state made his legacy official in the strongest way possible. By treating him not merely as a former ruler, but as a divine figure whose rule had been beneficial and whose system should continue. Even after death, the emperor's influence remained practical. He understood that legitimacy was built not only through armies and senatorial votes, but through tangible benefits. Peace mattered. Buildings mattered, jobs mattered, and money mattered. Financial gifts to citizens and soldiers appeared repeatedly during his reign and continued through his will, binding the population and the military to the regime with gratitude and expectation. After Actium, the battle didn't only reshape borders and careers, it also reshaped language. In the decades that followed, poets kept returning to that day on the water, turning a military decision into a symbol that could mean different things depending on who was speaking and who was listening. It is easy to dismiss those poems as official messaging, especially because many leading writers moved in circles close to Augustus and his cultural patrons. Yet the more closely the poetry is read, the harder it becomes to treat it as simple praise. The best writers of the age could celebrate the new order while still letting doubt, tension, and human complexity seep through. Two names dominate this literary aftermath: Horace and Virgil. Both lived through the collapse of the Old Republic and the exhaustion of civil war. Both wrote in a world where power had become personal again, where patronage mattered, and where public memory was being organized as carefully as the state itself. Their work shows that Actium became more than a victory. It became a story Rome told itself about identity, legitimacy, and the price of peace. Horace's background made him an unlikely emblem of the new regime's cultural confidence. He came from provincial Italy, raised by a father who had climbed from hardship into modest security, and he benefited from the kind of education that could propel a talented young man into public life. Horace moved through Rome and Greece, absorbed the older traditions, then returned to a homeland that was changing violently. His early career included service under the Republican side during the last convulsions of civil war. Later, he entered a literary world shaped by powerful friends of the new ruler, and his writing earned him protection and status. That personal arc matters because it explains the tone of his poetry. Controlled, polished, intelligent, and often double-edged. He could write praise without sounding like a hired announcer. He could sound confident while keeping a careful distance. Horace's earlier works used sharp edges and social observation, and he gained attention for a voice that could mock, critique, and entertain. When he turned to lyric poetry, he carried that precision with him. In pieces tied to Actium, the surface can look like straightforward victory celebration. The speaker imagines feasting, music, and relief as if an anxious city has finally exhaled. But the emotional engine is more complicated than party noise. These poems are not battlefield reports. They are responses to fear, to uncertainty, and to the sense that history has snapped into a new shape. In one major Actium-themed poem, the target is not simply an enemy fleet. The target is moral disorder. Antony appears as a man who has, in the poet's framing, surrendered Roman discipline and Roman masculinity to an alien court. The imagery is deliberately humiliating, pushing the audience to associate the opposing side with shame and inversion. That sounds like propaganda because it echoes the political attacks that had circulated in Rome for years. And yet, Horace does something interesting. The poem's energy is less about details of maneuver and more about psychological release. The victory matters because it dissolves dread. It allows ordinary people to stop imagining catastrophe and start imagining stability. The celebration is not only a celebration of conquest, it is a celebration of fear leaving the body. Horace's most famous treatment of the aftermath goes even further. It begins like a public toast to the end of danger. Cleopatra is introduced in the harsh terms Roman audiences expected. As a foreign ruler whose ambitions threatened Rome's centre and whose confidence had been inflated by good fortune. The poem initially seems to ask for a clean moral verdict. But as the lines unfold, the portrait shifts. The defeated queen is not presented as a cartoon villain. She becomes something more unsettling and more human. A leader, capable of composure, pride, and an ending chosen rather than begged for. Her death is not framed as grovelling. It is framed as a refusal to be displayed, a final claim to dignity under impossible pressure. That is where Horace becomes hard to flatten into a single message. The poem praises Rome's survival, but it also grants the fallen opponent a kind of respect. The voice recognizes courage even while opposing the cause. In other words, the victory is not pure sunlight. It casts shadows. The reader is allowed to feel relief and discomfort at the same time. That ambiguity is exactly what makes the poetry last. Simple slogans expire. Uneasy truth remains. Virgil approaches Actium from a different angle. Where Horace often sounds like a sharp observer of society, Virgil sounds like a builder of myths. He grew up in northern Italy and watched the civil wars tear through the countryside. Land confiscations and veteran settlements were not abstract policies to him. They were lived trauma, the kind that displaced families and altered communities overnight. That experience left a mark on his imagination. Even when he wrote about fields and seasons, there was an undercurrent of loss, labour, and fragility. When he later turned to epic, he wasn't simply entertaining, he was attempting to explain Rome to itself. Virgil's rise was shaped by patronage and by extraordinary talent. His earlier works brought him into elite circles, and he was encouraged to attempt something more ambitious. A national epic that could connect Rome's present to a heroic past. The story he chose placed a Trojan survivor at the beginning of the Roman road, turning Rome's identity into a long journey of suffering, duty, and transformation. That framework is important because it sets up how Actium appears in his epic world. Virgil does not treat the battle like a newspaper headline. He treats it like destiny made visible. One of the epic's most famous scenes involves a magnificent shield made for the hero before battle. The shield is not only armour, it is a moving gallery of Roman history, a timeline engraved into metal, showing events that belong to Virgil's world but are still in the future from the hero's perspective. The point is psychological. The hero carries the future without fully understanding it. The audience understands it completely, and the audience is invited to measure the present against the cost of its creation. At the centre of that shield is Actium. The placement is not accidental. It tells the viewer that this battle was seen as a hinge, a moment when the direction of Rome's entire story changed. Virgil's scene presents the major figures, the commanding minds, and the sense of a world watching. The forces appear not just as soldiers, but as representatives of cultures, regions, and political futures. Even the gods enter the picture, because epic language turns human conflict into cosmic spectacle. The battle becomes an argument about what kind of world will exist after the smoke clears. Yet the most striking choice Virgil makes is not simply to show a victory. He shows movement, panic, and retreat. He does not linger on heroic details of sailors dying at their oars, or warriors leaping onto decks. He emphasizes the breaking point, the moment when one side pulls away and the sea itself seems to carry the defeated back toward home. The imagery makes the flight feel fated, heavy, and mournful rather than comedic. The defeated are not erased. They are carried into the future as a memory that will haunt the triumph. That is where Virgil's complexity emerges. The epic celebrates the order that follows. It also admits the violence that creates that order. The audience can admire the stability of the new age while feeling the grief of what was crushed to build it. The shield is a masterpiece, but it is also a warning. Rome's greatness is inseparable from suffering, and the line between necessary force and destructive ambition is never clean. Taken together, Horace and Virgil show why Actium mattered beyond tactics. The battle itself, judged purely as a contest of ships, doesn't always read like the most dazzling episode in military history. It becomes unforgettable because of what it signalled. It marked the end of one political world and the beginning of another. It opened a period of peace, rebuilding, and cultural brilliance. But it also confirmed that Rome's future would revolve around a single dominant figure rather than the older competitive system. That is why poets kept returning to Actium. It was not only about who won, it was about what winning meant. It was about fear being replaced by control. It was about civil war being rebranded as national salvation. It was about a foreign queen becoming a symbol, powerful enough to unify a divided public. And about a Roman leader becoming so central that the state's story had to be rewritten around him. The poetry does not hand down a single verdict. It does something more enduring. It forces the listener to hold two ideas at once: that Rome needed an end to chaos and that endings have a cost. The poems survive because they are not just banners waving over a parade. They are mirrors held up to a turning point, showing triumph and loss in the same reflection.